I have been on this bench for 40 years. In that time, I have learned to read a room the moment I walk into it. The temperature of it, the weight of it, who is carrying something, and who is performing, and who walked in with nothing left to lose. The morning of September 19th, I walked into my courtroom and felt all three at once. On the left side of the room, at the plaintiff's table, sat a man named Gerald Kowalski. He was 61 years old. He was wearing a gray button-down shirt that had been ironed carefully. The kind of ironing that takes effort when you don't have a proper ironing board, when you're working with what you have. His slacks were clean, his shoes were worn down at the heels but polished. He had a folder in front of him, thin, a few pages at most. He sat with his spine straight and his hands flat on the table, and he looked at the front of the room with the particular stillness of a man who has learned over a long time how to be very quiet and take up very little space. On the right side, at the defendant's table, sat Daniel Mercer. He was 47 years old. He ran a commercial real estate development company that his father had started and that he had grown over the past 2 decades into something worth considerably more than his father had ever imagined. He was dressed well, as men like him always are. Dark suit, open collar, a watch that costs more than most people's cars. He had 2 attorneys with him, 2. For a civil hearing in municipal court, he sat back in his chair with one arm draped over the back of it, the way a man sits when he wants the room to understand that he is not particularly concerned about being there. He had not looked at Gerald Kowalski once since I entered. The case before me was a small claims dispute. Gerald Kowalski was suing Daniel Mercer for $1,200. That was the number, $1,200. In a room where one man had 2 attorneys and the other had a thin folder and worn-down shoes, we were here over $1,200. I called the case and asked Gerald to explain what had brought him to my courtroom. He cleared his throat. He was not accustomed to speaking in rooms like this. You could hear it in the careful way he chose his words, the slight pause before each sentence, the way he watched my face to make sure he was being understood. He told me that for the past 14 months he had been employed by one of Daniel Mercer's properties, a commercial building on the east side of the city, as a night security guard. He had been hired through a staffing agency, worked his shifts without incident, and had been told by his direct supervisor in writing that he would receive a year-end bonus of $1,200 in December. He had that in writing. It was in the folder. He placed it on the table and pushed it toward the center. In December, the bonus did not arrive. He contacted the staffing agency. They told him the client, Mercer Development, had declined to authorize it. He contacted Mercer Development directly. He was transferred twice and then told by someone in an administrative role that the bonus structure had been revised and that he was not eligible. No explanation, no alternative offer, just a door closing. He had tried for 3 months to resolve it through the proper channels. He had documented everything, every call, every email, every name. It was all in that thin folder. When nothing moved, he filed here. $1,200. It was, he told me quietly, 4 months of groceries. I looked at him when he said that. I looked at the worn heels on his shoes and the careful ironing on his shirt, and I did not say anything yet. I just listened. Then I turned to Daniel Mercer. His lead attorney, a sharp woman named Patricia Voss, rose immediately and began outlining the defense. The staffing agreement, she said, placed all compensation decisions with the agency, not with Mercer Development directly. The bonus had been a discretionary arrangement, not a contractual obligation. The written communication Gerald had received from his supervisor was not binding on the company. She was fluent and precise, and she made it sound very reasonable. I thanked her and asked if her client wished to add anything. Daniel Mercer looked up from his phone. He had been on his phone, and said, yes, actually he did. He stood up. He straightened his jacket. He looked at me with the comfortable ease of a man who has spent his career in rooms where his presence alone was usually enough to determine the outcome. He said that he ran a large operation, that he had over 300 employees and contractors across 14 properties, that he could not personally track every staffing arrangement at every site. He said that Gerald Kowalski had been a contract worker, not a direct employee, and that the terms of his compensation were between him and the agency. He said that Mercer Development had fulfilled every obligation it had under the staffing agreement. Then he looked at me with a small, patient smile, the smile of a man who has already decided this is a minor inconvenience, and said, if Mr. Kowalski believes he has a legal claim against my company, Your Honor, he is welcome to sue me. He sat back down. The courtroom was very quiet. I looked at Gerald Kowalski. He had not reacted. He had heard that tone before in those 3 months of phone calls and closed doors. He had heard the version of those words many times. He just sat there, hands flat on the table, waiting. I asked Gerald a question. I asked him to tell me a little more about himself, not about the case, about himself. He looked at me with some surprise, then he nodded and began. He had grown up in western Pennsylvania, the son of a coal miner. His father had worked the same mine for 31 years. His older brother had too. Gerald had enlisted in the Army at 18 in 1982 because he wanted something different, not because he didn't love his family or his town, but because he had always felt the pull of a larger world, and the military was the door that was open to him. He served for 11 years, military police mostly. He was good at it. He was the kind of soldier, he said, who believed in doing the job correctly and leaving the place better than you found it. He was promoted twice. He had a commendation. He was, by every measure available to him, building something. Then came the Gulf in 1991. He was there for 8 months. He came back with both his legs and all his fingers, and what he described very simply as a head that wouldn't quiet down. He did not use clinical language. He did not have to. I have heard enough veterans describe it in enough different ways over 40 years that I understood exactly what he meant. He tried to stay in. He lasted 2 more years before the Army, and he agreed mutually and without drama that it was time to separate. He came home to Pennsylvania, then moved to the city because there was supposed to be more work. He got married. He worked a series of jobs, security, warehouse, a driving job for a while. His wife was patient for as long as she could be, and then she wasn't, and he didn't blame her for that either. The apartment went with the marriage. For a period after that, he stayed with friends, then with his older brother, and then when he had exhausted those options without meaning to, he stopped asking and started sleeping in his car. 14 months in that car. He said it quietly. 14 months of parking in different lots so he didn't get ticketed, of using gas station bathrooms to wash up before day shifts, of eating from convenience stores and saving every receipt because he had learned somewhere in those 14 months that documentation was the only thing he could fully control. He told me all of this in the same careful voice he had used to describe the unpaid bonus. No performance, no appeal for sympathy, just the facts of a life stated plainly to a person who had asked. About 2.5 years before this hearing, he had found a room in a transitional housing program for veterans on the north side of the city. He had found the security job through a workforce reentry program. A coordinator there had helped him put together a resume and had connected him with the staffing agency. He had worked every shift at the Mercer building without exception. He had never been late. He had never had a complaint filed against him by the property management or the agency or anyone else. His supervisor, the same man who had sent him the bonus communication, had written him a positive review at the 6-month mark. He had been saving, carefully, methodically, a little at a time, the way a man saves when he has learned not to take any number for granted. His goal was a proper apartment, his own lease, his own key. He had calculated what he needed. The $1,200 bonus had been factored into that calculation. It was not abstract money to him. It was a specific, concrete number of months closer to a door he could unlock himself and close behind him and know that it would still be his in the morning. By the time he finished, the room had changed. I do not mean that anyone said anything. No one did. I mean the quality of the silence had shifted. The 2 attorneys at the defendant's table were both looking at the table. Even Daniel Mercer, who had been positioned comfortably in his chair with one arm draped over the back, had changed his posture. He was sitting forward now, both feet on the floor. I looked at the written communication Gerald had submitted. It was a message from his direct supervisor, a man named Carl Hendricks, listed in his email signature as Site Operations Manager, Mercer Development Group, with a Mercer Development email address and Mercer Development letterhead in the header, stating clearly that Gerald was eligible for the year-end performance bonus and that the amount would be $1,200 payable in the December payroll cycle. It was dated October 4th. Gerald had continued working at the building for 3 more months after receiving it. I read it twice. Then I read it a 3rd time. I asked Patricia Voss to walk me through the argument that this communication did not represent a commitment from Mercer Development. There was a pause that lasted slightly longer than it should have. She gave me the best answer she had. It was a technically constructed answer. the kind of answer that exists in law school hypotheticals and deposition prep sessions and does not survive contact with a room full of actual human beings. Carl Hendricks, she said, had exceeded his authorization level. The bonus approval process at Mercer Development required sign-off from a regional director before any communication was made to the employee. Hendricks had sent the message prematurely before that sign-off was obtained. The subsequent decision by regional leadership not to authorize the bonus had been communicated through the staffing agency. I asked whether Gerald Kowalski had been informed at any point before December that the bonus he had been promised in writing was subject to a further authorization process. She said he had not been specifically informed of the internal approval chain. I asked whether at any point anyone from Mercer Development had reached out to Gerald directly to tell him the bonus had not been authorized. Another pause. She said the communication had gone through the agency. I asked when. She conferred with her colleague. The date she gave me was January 14th, 6 weeks after the bonus was supposed to have been paid. 6 weeks after Gerald Kowalski had already structured his savings around it, already made decisions based on it, already worked 3 additional months of night shifts in the reasonable belief that the written promise made to him by a man with a Mercer Development title was going to be honored. I set the papers down. I looked at the table for a moment. I have had 40 years of practice at keeping my face neutral, but there are cases where neutrality requires more effort than others, and this was one of them. I have thought a great deal over 40 years about what courts are for. There is the formal answer, which involves statutes and jurisdiction and the proper application of law. And then there is the answer underneath that, the one that doesn't fit neatly into a textbook, but that I have never been able to argue myself out of. Courts exist because human beings are not always fair to each other, because the distance between what is legal and what is right is sometimes very large, and someone has to stand in that distance and make a decision. That is what I was put here to do, not just to read contracts, to look at the whole picture, to ask whether what happened was fair, to ask whether the people in this room were treated as human beings. I looked at Daniel Mercer. I told him that I had read the written communication Gerald submitted. I told him that I found it clear, specific, and issued by someone with apparent authority to issue it. I told him that Gerald Kowalski had acted in reasonable reliance on that communication, had planned his finances around it, had continued to show up and do his job in the reasonable expectation that the promise made to him would be honored. I told him that $1,200 was not a rounding error in his operating budget. I knew what his company's annual revenue looked like. It was a matter of public record. $1,200 was to his company nothing. To Gerald Kowalski, it was 4 months of groceries. I said, I am finding in favor of the plaintiff. Judgment for Gerald Kowalski, $1,200 plus filing costs. Patricia Voss was already writing. Daniel Mercer's expression was unreadable, but I was not finished. I told the courtroom that before I closed the case, I wanted to say something for the record. Not about the legal finding, which stood on its own, about something else. I said that Gerald Kowalski had served this country for 11 years, that he had deployed to a war and come back changed, as soldiers do, and had spent years rebuilding himself from almost nothing, that he had accepted help when he needed it, had worked his way back into stability one careful step at a time, had shown up to every shift at a building owned by a man who did not know his name and had never once wondered what his life looked like. I said that when Gerald had tried to collect on a promise that was made to him in writing by a representative of that man's company, the response he received was not an explanation or an apology or an attempt to make it right. The response he received was "sue me." I said that 2 words can tell you a great deal about a person, about what they believe the rules are for, about who they think the rules apply to. I said that in this courtroom, they apply to everyone. Daniel Mercer did not say anything. His attorneys were gathering their papers. Gerald Kowalski sat very still. Then I said something I do not always say, because I do not believe it is my place to editorialize beyond what the case requires. But this case required it. I said, Mr. Mercer, you have the right to leave here today and never think about Gerald Kowalski again. The judgment is $1,200. It will not inconvenience you in any meaningful way. You can write that check and go back to your 14 properties and your 300 contractors and your comfortable chair, and you will feel nothing. But I want you to understand something before you go. You had a man working nights in one of your buildings for 14 months. He secured your property while you slept. He showed up in the rain and the cold and the dark every shift without complaint, and he did it because he needed the work and because someone told him there was a bonus waiting at the end of the year. He planned his life around that promise. And when it did not come and he tried to find out why, your company gave him 6 weeks of silence and then a phone call telling him the policy had changed. That man is sitting in this room right now, and he ironed his shirt to come here. He put together a folder of every document he had, and he filed a claim for $1,200, an amount you spend on a business lunch, because he had no other option. Because sue me, when said to a man with nothing, is not a challenge. It is a door slamming in his face. I looked at Mercer directly. You have 2 attorneys here today who bill by the hour. I would estimate that getting them into this room this morning cost you more than $1,200. Think about that on your way out. The courtroom was absolutely still. Daniel Mercer looked at me for a long moment. The comfortable ease was gone. The arm over the chair posture was gone. He looked for the first time since I had entered the room like a man sitting in a place where the usual rules did not apply. He nodded once. Then he and his attorneys gathered their things and they left. Gerald Kowalski sat at his table. He had not moved. After the room cleared a little, I looked at him from the bench and told him the clerk would provide him with the paperwork for the judgment and explain the collection process. He said, "Thank you, Your Honor." I said, "You did everything right, Mr. Kowalski. You documented everything, you followed the proper channels, and you came here when you had no other option. That is exactly what this court is here for." He nodded. He picked up his folder. He stood carefully with the slight stiffness of a man whose body has been through more than it should have been put through, and he walked out of my courtroom. I sat at the bench for a long time after that. The afternoon had gotten quiet. My clerk was at her desk. The court officer was by the door. I had a stack of other cases that afternoon, and I knew I needed to move through them, but I sat with September 19th for a few more minutes before I did. I thought about the phrase, "sue me," about how it sounds different depending on who says it and who hears it. When Daniel Mercer said it, it was a dismissal, a flick of the wrist, an invitation he was absolutely certain no one would accept, because accepting it requires resources and time and belief that the effort will be worth it, and people like Gerald Kowalski are not, in the experience of people like Daniel Mercer, the kind of people who have those things. What Mercer had not calculated was the ironed shirt, the thin folder, the 14 months of documentation, the man sitting at that table who had spent 2 years rebuilding something out of almost nothing and had not, in all of that time, stopped believing that doing things correctly eventually counts for something. I thought about Carl Hendricks, the site operations manager who had sent that October email. I did not have him in front of me. I did not know whether he had sent that message carelessly or in good faith, or what he had felt in January when he found out the authorization had not come through. But I thought about what it means to be the person who stands between a company and its workers and what you owe to both, and how easy it is to let one side of that equation disappear when one side has 2 attorneys and the other has a folder. I thought about the 14 properties, the 300 contractors, the comfortable chair, the arm draped over the back of it. I thought about what we have decided as a society to ask of people like Gerald Kowalski. We ask them to go when we need them to go. We ask them to serve in conditions that change them in ways we do not fully account for when we send them. We ask them to come back and be fine, or to become fine, or to manage not being fine quietly and without inconveniencing anyone. We ask them to accept help gracefully and rebuild themselves steadily and show up to every shift and document everything and follow the proper channels and not give up when the proper channels do not respond for 3 months. We ask a great deal. The least that is owed in return, the absolute floor of what is owed, is that when a promise is made to them in writing, it is kept. And when it is not kept, and they come here with their documentation and their ironed shirt and their thin folder, they are heard. That is what courts are for. I have been on this bench for 40 years. I have presided over cases that involve millions of dollars and cases that involve grocery money, and I will tell you with certainty that the weight of a case has nothing to do with the dollar amount. The weight of a case is determined by what is at stake for the person standing in front of you. $1,200 was Gerald Kowalski's next step. his own apartment, his own door, 4 months of groceries, and the particular irreplaceable dignity of not having to count every single one. Daniel Mercer had said, "Sue me," because he was certain that no one would, because that certainty had served him well across 14 properties and 300 contractors, and however many October emails had gone unanswered before this one. Gerald Kowalski had sued him, and on September 19th, in this courtroom, it had counted for exactly as much as it should. I hope Mercer thought about it on the drive home. I hope he thought about the iron shirt. I hope somewhere in the back of whatever part of him remains capable of sitting with something uncomfortable, he thought about a man who spent 14 months in a car and came back from that and secured his building every night for 14 months and planned his future around $1,200 that a person with his title had promised in writing. I hope he thought about what "sue me" costs when you say it to someone who has already paid everything he has. But I did not need him to. The judgment stood. Gerald Kowalski walked out of this courtroom with what he was owed. That was enough. That was what September 19th was for. If this story stayed with you, if it made you think about the Geralds in your life, the people who show up quietly and do the work and ask for nothing more than what was promised, share it today. Subscribe to this channel because I have 40 years of these and I'm not finished. And leave me a comment. Tell me about someone who kept rebuilding when it would have been so much easier to stop. Tell me their name. People like Gerald Kowalski deserve more than the silence of a closed door.